A weary Labrador retriever mother struggles through the icy waters of a freezing river. Her golden coat, now soaked and clinging to her trembling body, glistens in the pale winter light. She clutches a rotting piece of driftwood in her jaws, where three tiny puppies lie huddled together, their soaked fur offering little protection from the biting cold. The freezing wind howls through the air, pushing chunks of ice dangerously close as the river's relentless current threatens to pull them under. Just days ago, she rested peacefully by her owner's side, Margaret Bowen, a kind-hearted woman who rescued her from the streets and gave her a life of safety and love. But now, Maya fights alone, not just for herself, but for her three helpless pups. How did she end up here, battling for survival in this merciless river? And will anyone come to save them before it's too late? The winter in Whitefall, Montana, was relentless. Snow blanketed the small town, muffling every sound except for the howling wind and the occasional crack of ice on the river. The old wooden bridge over the freezing river creaked under the weight of Daniel Harris's boots as he walked to the edge. His breath formed faint clouds in the frosty air, but his chest felt hollow. Daniel stared down at the icy waters below, his gaze as lifeless as the landscape around him. Once he had been a man of routine and quiet happiness. He had a job at the local factory, a small home that he and his wife Emily had built a life in, and dreams that felt modest but fulfilling. But that was before cancer stole Emily from him, before the layoffs at the factory stripped him of his sense of purpose. And now there was nothing left but the unbearable silence and the weight of days blending into each other. Standing on the bridge, Daniel let his hands grip the frozen railing. The cold seeped through his gloves, biting into his skin, but he didn't pull away. It was fitting, he thought. The cold matched the emptiness inside him. With one deep breath, he closed his eyes and leaned forward, ready to let the icy waters take him. But then a sound broke through the stillness. A faint, desperate bark echoed up from the river below. His eyes snapped open, and he instinctively scanned the dark waters. At first, he saw nothing but broken chunks of ice floating aimlessly downstream. Then, in the distance, a shape emerged, something moving against the current. As it drifted closer, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A large, rotting piece of driftwood bobbed in the icy water, and clinging to it was a golden-yellow Labrador retriever, her soaked fur clinging to her trembling body. The dog's eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto Daniel's as she barked again, her voice weak but insistent. On the driftwood, three small puppies huddled together, their tiny bodies quivering as they clung to their mother for warmth and safety. For a moment, Daniel froze. The scene before him was surreal, a family of dogs struggling to survive in the frigid river, just as he had been standing moments away from surrendering to it. He couldn't look away from the Labrador mother, who was holding on with every ounce of strength she had left, her determination fierce despite the odds stacked against her. Something inside him shifted. Without thinking, Daniel pulled off his coat and tossed it to the ground. He grabbed the length of rope he always kept in his truck and ran toward the edge of the bridge, his boots slipping on the ice. He tied one end of the rope around the bridge's railing and the other around his waist. Then, bracing himself, he climbed over the railing and lowered himself into the freezing water. The shock of the cold hit him like a wall, stealing the air from his lungs and making his muscles seize. But he forced himself to move, pushing through the icy current toward the driftwood. The Labrador mother barked again, her voice hoarse but urging, as if she understood he was there to help. When Daniel reached the driftwood, he grabbed hold of the rotting log and pulled it toward him. The puppies whimpered, their tiny paws slipping on the wet surface, but their mother shifted to steady them, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "I've got you," Daniel murmured through chattering teeth. "Hold on." With every ounce of strength he had, Daniel began to drag the driftwood back toward the shore. The current fought against him, and the cold water felt like knives slicing into his skin. But he didn't stop. The Labrador paddled beside him, her body weak but still pushing forward to stay close to her puppies. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel felt his feet touch the riverbed. He stumbled onto the snowy bank, pulling the driftwood and the dogs onto solid ground. The Labrador collapsed onto the snow, her body heaving with exhaustion, but her eyes darted immediately to her puppies, checking to make sure they were safe. Daniel untied the rope from his waist and dropped to his knees, breathing hard. His fingers were numb, his clothes soaked and freezing, but he managed to pull the puppies off the driftwood and wrap them in the remnants of his coat. They whimpered softly, their tiny bodies trembling as they pressed together for warmth. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, his voice shaky but gentle. "You're safe now." The Labrador crawled closer to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and weariness. She rested her head against his leg, a silent acknowledgement of what he had done. Daniel reached down and placed a hand on her wet fur, feeling the rapid thrum of her heartbeat beneath his fingers. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something other than emptiness. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something, a spark of purpose, a reminder that life, even in its most fragile forms, was worth fighting for. He gathered the puppies and helped the Labrador to her feet. Together they made their way to his truck, where he placed the dogs gently inside and cranked the heater to full blast. As he drove home through the snowy streets, his mind began to churn with questions. Who did this? How had this family of dogs ended up in such a desperate situation? And what could he do now to ensure they wouldn't have to suffer again? When they arrived at his small, quiet home, Daniel carried the dogs inside and laid them on a pile of blankets near the heater. The Labrador immediately curled around her puppies, licking their fur and murmuring soft whimpers of reassurance. Daniel sat back and watched them, his heart heavy, but no longer empty. He didn't have the answers yet, but as he looked at the Labrador mother, her fierce determination to protect her young despite everything, he knew he couldn't turn away. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had something to hold on to, and maybe, just maybe, saving them had saved him too. The morning sun filtered weakly through the frosted windows of Daniel's modest home, casting a pale glow over the living room. Near the heater, the Labrador mother lay curled around her 3 puppies. Her golden yellow coat, now dry, had regained some of its shine, and her breathing had steadied. The puppies, Buddy, Daisy, and Max, were nestled close to her, their tiny bodies rising and falling in rhythmic sleep. Daniel stood nearby, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. His gaze remained fixed on the dogs, his mind replaying the events of the previous day. Despite the warmth of the heater, the image of the freezing river and Maya's desperate eyes lingered in his thoughts. He hadn't planned on naming them, but as he sat with the family of 4 through the night, tending to their needs and wrapping them in whatever blankets he could find, the names had come naturally. Maya for the mother whose strength and resolve had saved her puppies. Buddy, the largest of the litter, who seemed to have an adventurous spirit. Daisy, the smallest and most timid. And Max, the bold one, always eager to explore even within the confines of the makeshift bed Daniel had made for them. Maya's eyes caught his attention now. Even as she rested, there was something deeply unsettling about the way her gaze flitted around the room. Her large, expressive eyes were watchful, almost haunted, as if she expected danger to lurk at every corner. She licked Buddy's fur absent-mindedly, but her ears twitched at every creak of the old house. "You've been through something, haven't you?" Daniel muttered under his breath. He crouched down beside her, holding out his hand. Maya hesitated for a moment, before pressing her nose into his palm. Her touch was tentative, her trust fragile but not broken. Daniel had always believed that animals could sense intention, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Maya's caution wasn't just a result of her ordeal in the river. It felt deeper, as though it was tied to something far more sinister. The next morning, Daniel loaded Maya and the puppies into his truck. The small veterinary clinic on the edge of Whitefall wasn't far, but the journey was tense. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her posture stiff. She seemed more at ease with Daniel, but still watched the passing landscape with a wary expression. The puppies, bundled in a blanket, slept soundly in the back. Dr. Emily Clark greeted Daniel at the clinic door. She was a young woman with a kind smile and an easy demeanor, her brown hair tied back in a neat ponytail. "You've brought quite the family," Emily said, kneeling to get a closer look at Maya. The dog flinched slightly but stayed still, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. Daniel explained how he had found them, omitting the part about standing on the bridge, lost in his own despair. Emily nodded, her brows furrowed in concern as she examined Maya's coat, checking for injuries or signs of malnutrition. "She's been through a lot," Emily murmured, her hands gentle but efficient. "But she's a fighter." Emily ran a scanner over Maya's neck and paused when a soft beep sounded. Daniel watched as she read the information on the screen. Her expression shifted, something between surprise and unease. "Maya belongs to someone," Emily said, glancing up at Daniel. "According to her microchip, her owner is Margaret Bowen. Does that name ring a bell?" Daniel shook his head, but the name sounded oddly familiar. "Who is she?" "Margaret Bowen is, well, she's practically a local legend," Emily explained. "She's wealthy, but more than that, she's known for her love of animals. She's funded shelters, sponsored veterinary programs, even set up an adoption network for rescue dogs. Maya must have been one of her personal pets." Daniel glanced at the Labrador mother, who had relaxed slightly under Emily's care. It was difficult to imagine her as a pampered pet, given the state he had found her in. "Why would someone like Margaret let this happen to her dogs?" Daniel asked, more to himself than to Emily. Emily hesitated, then sighed. "Margaret's been in the hospital. She was in a car accident a few weeks ago, near the bridge where you said you found Maya. She's been in a coma ever since." The words hit Daniel like a blow. He looked down at Maya, who was now licking Daisy's fur with quiet focus. A car accident, near the bridge. The pieces didn't fit. "So she's just been lying there, and no one's taken care of these dogs?" Daniel's voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through. Emily shook her head. "It's hard to say. Margaret lived alone, as far as I know. But the fact that Maya and her puppies ended up in the river—" She trailed off, the weight of the unspoken possibilities hanging in the air. On the drive back home, Daniel's thoughts churned. He had initially assumed that Maya and the puppies were victims of neglect or abandonment, but knowing they belonged to someone like Margaret Bowen made the situation far more complicated. The question gnawed at him. How did a woman so dedicated to animals let her own pets fall into such danger? Was it truly an accident that led Maya and her puppies to the river, or was there something darker at play? Maya lay in the passenger seat, her head resting on the edge of the window. She seemed calmer now, her trust in Daniel growing steadily. But her eyes still held that haunted look, as though she knew something that she couldn't share. When they arrived home, Daniel placed the puppies back on their makeshift bed and watched as Maya settled around them. Her maternal instincts were fierce, her attention unwavering, but the shadows in her eyes lingered. As he sat back on his worn couch, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Maya held the key to whatever had happened to Margaret Bowen. And if she did, it was now his responsibility to uncover the truth, for Margaret, for Maya, and for the 3 tiny lives depending on them both. The snow continued to fall steadily as Daniel parked his truck at the side of the road, his eyes fixed on the house across the street. Margaret Bowen's estate was larger than he had expected. Its sprawling grounds bordered by an old iron fence, the gate firmly shut. The house itself was grand yet cold, its pale facade standing starkly against the winter landscape. Daniel leaned back in his seat, unsure of his next move. He had come here on impulse, driven by a gnawing curiosity about Margaret and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Maya and her puppies. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but felt compelled to start somewhere. He had barely stepped out of his truck when a voice called out from behind him. "Looking for someone?" Daniel turned to see a woman bundled in a heavy coat, holding a leash attached to a small terrier. Her expression was friendly but tinged with curiosity as she approached. Daniel hesitated, glancing back at the estate. "I heard this house belonged to Margaret Bowen. I found one of her dogs and thought I'd check in." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "You found Maya?" Daniel nodded. "Her and 3 puppies." The woman sighed, a mix of relief and sadness crossing her face. "I'm Laura. I live just down the road. Poor Margaret. She loved that dog. Loved all animals, really. It's a shame what's happened." Daniel's curiosity deepened. "What do you mean?" Laura shifted uncomfortably, her breath visible in the cold air. "Margaret's been in the hospital since the accident. A car crash not far from the bridge where you said you found Maya. She's in a coma now." Daniel frowned. "Was she alone when it happened?" "Yes. She lived by herself. Never married, no kids. Her animals were her family. She was working on setting up some big animal rescue fund. Wanted to make it her legacy." "An animal rescue fund?" Daniel asked, surprised. Laura nodded. "She'd been planning it for years. Her idea was to use half her estate for the fund, and the other half would go to her brother Richard. Not that he deserved it." The mention of Richard made Daniel pause. "Why do you say that?" "Because he's nothing like Margaret," Laura replied with a scowl. "He's trouble, always has been, gambles away whatever money he gets his hands on. And he's got a temper, too. They argued a lot, mostly about money. He thought she was crazy for leaving so much to her animals instead of him." The pieces began to align in Daniel's mind, but he couldn't ignore the growing unease in his gut. "Was he around before the accident?" Daniel asked cautiously. Laura nodded. "He'd been staying here for a few months. Said he wanted to help Margaret since she was getting older, but I think he was just waiting for her to change her mind about the will." "And after the accident?" Laura hesitated, her expression darkening. "He took over everything. The house, her finances, the animals. At first I thought he might try to keep things running for Margaret's sake, but, well, Maya and the puppies disappeared not long after. He claimed they ran off, but I don't believe him. Richard never liked animals. He used to complain about Maya all the time, saying she was a nuisance." Daniel's jaw tightened. The image of Maya clinging to that driftwood in the freezing river resurfaced in his mind, her desperate eyes still vivid. If what Laura said was true, then Richard's involvement couldn't be dismissed as mere coincidence. Daniel thanked Laura for her time and watched as she walked back toward her home, the little terrier trotting obediently at her side. He turned his attention back to Margaret's estate, the house looming behind the iron gate like a silent witness to everything that had happened. Something didn't sit right. Margaret's devotion to her animals was clear from the way Laura described her, yet Maya and her puppies had been abandoned in the most cruel and dangerous way imaginable. If Richard had truly been left in charge, it wasn't hard to imagine that he had something to do with their plight. But then there was the accident, Margaret's crash near the bridge. Was it just a tragic coincidence? Or was it possible that Richard's desperation for control had driven him to something far worse? Daniel took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists inside his coat pockets. He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was certain. The story behind Margaret's accident and Maya's abandonment was far from over. As he climbed back into his truck, Maya shifted in the passenger seat, her gaze following him intently. "We'll figure this out," he muttered, his voice low but resolute. "Whatever happened, we'll find the truth." The engine roared to life, and Daniel drove away from the estate, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him. Somewhere in the tangled threads of Margaret's life and Richard's greed lay the truth, and Daniel was determined to uncover it. The cold wind whipped through the trees as Daniel stepped onto the old wooden bridge where everything had started. The memory of that night Maya's desperate barks, the freezing water, and the weight of pulling her and her puppies to safety flooded his mind. He tightened his scarf and surveyed the riverbank below, determined to find answers. Climbing carefully down the snowy embankment, Daniel retraced his steps to the spot where he had pulled Maya and the puppies to shore. The river's surface was calmer now, but the icy chunks floating downstream served as a grim reminder of the danger they had faced. As his eyes scanned the area, something caught his attention near a patch of dense bushes by the water. Pushing aside the branches, he found it, a thick, rusted chain with one end cleanly severed, as though it had been cut with bolt cutters. The chain was tangled in the undergrowth, partially frozen to the ground. Daniel's chest tightened as he picked it up, the icy metal biting into his fingers, even through his gloves. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately tied Maya and her puppies to the driftwood and sent them into the river, hoping the current would carry them far away. Or worse, who could be so cruel? He carefully wrapped the chain and placed it in his bag, determined to bring it to someone who could help. The Whitefall police station was a modest building, its walls adorned with faded photographs of the town's history. Sheriff John Miller, a grizzled man in his late 50s, greeted Daniel with a curious look as he walked in. "Daniel Harris," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you here?" Daniel placed the chain on the desk between them. "I found this by the river where I rescued a dog and her puppies. Someone cut it and tied them to a piece of driftwood. They would have drowned if I hadn't been there." Miller's brows furrowed as he picked up the chain, turning it over in his hands. "This isn't just neglect. This is deliberate. You're sure it was at the same spot?" Daniel nodded. "I'm certain. And there's more. The dog, Maya, belonged to Margaret Bowen. She's in a coma after a car accident and her brother Richard is controlling everything. Something about this doesn't feel right." The sheriff leaned forward, his expression serious. "Deliberate animal cruelty is one thing, but if it ties back to Margaret's accident, we're looking at something much bigger. Problem is, I need more than a chain to connect the dots. If this was tied to her estate, Richard would have motive, but proving it, that's a different story." Daniel clenched his fists. There has to be something. Richard didn't just let those dogs go, he wanted them gone, for good. Miller sighed, placing the chain carefully to the side. "I'll keep this as evidence, but unless we find something concrete, something that ties him to Margaret's accident or the dogs, it's not enough to reopen the case." Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Daniel made his way to Whitefall General Hospital, where Margaret had been admitted after the crash. The stark white hallways smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the soft hum of machines filled the air. He approached the nurses' station, where a middle-aged nurse with auburn hair looked up from her clipboard. Her name tag read, "Linda Johnson." "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. Daniel nodded. "I'm here about Margaret Bowen. I'm trying to understand what happened before her accident." Linda's expression grew guarded. "Are you a relative?" "No, but I think her brother Richard might have had something to do with what happened to her dogs, and maybe more." Linda hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "I don't know much about the dogs, but I can tell you this. Richard's been here more times than I can count since Margaret was admitted. Every time he's tried to convince the doctors to pull the plug, saying Margaret wouldn't want to live like this." Daniel's stomach sank. "And has he succeeded?" Linda shook her head. "No, Margaret didn't leave clear instructions about her medical care, and without the proper paperwork we can't do anything. But it's obvious what he wants, control over her estate, and he's getting impatient." As Daniel left the hospital, Linda's words echoed in his mind. Richard wasn't just trying to get rid of the dogs. He was trying to erase every obstacle standing between him and Margaret's fortune. The chain by the river, Maya's haunted eyes, and Richard's repeated attempts to end Margaret's life all pointed to one conclusion. Richard had planned everything. The accident, the dog's abandonment, and now his push to claim the estate. Back in his truck, Daniel looked over at Maya, who rested in the passenger seat, her eyes watchful but calmer than before. The puppies slept soundly in their makeshift bed in the back. "We're getting closer," he murmured, gripping the steering wheel. "We'll figure this out. For Margaret, for you." The road ahead was still unclear, but one thing was certain. Daniel wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the picture they revealed was darker than Daniel could have imagined. He sat in his living room, the crackling of the heater the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Maya lay on the rug, her eyes following Daniel's every move, while her puppies tumbled playfully beside her. The warmth of the scene felt at odds with the cold truth he was beginning to uncover. Daniel had spent days piecing together fragments of information from the neighbors, the police, and the hospital. Each thread led back to one man, Richard Bowen. Through his conversations, Daniel learned about Margaret's will. It was as Laura had described. Half of her estate was to go to Richard, and the other half was intended for an animal rescue fund. The fund wasn't just a vague idea. It was Margaret's legacy, something she had poured her heart into creating. And at the center of it all was Maya and her puppies. They were more than pets. They were the symbols of her mission, the faces of her cause. But there was a catch. The terms of the will stipulated that if Maya and her puppies were no longer in Margaret's care, the fund would be invalidated. The money earmarked for the rescue effort would default entirely to Richard. For a man drowning in debt and bitter about his sister's devotion to animals, the solution was chillingly clear. It all made sense now. Margaret's accident wasn't just a tragic coincidence, it was the first step in Richard's plan. With her in a coma, he gained control over her assets, but Maya and her puppies posed a problem. As long as they were alive and accounted for, the rescue fund remained active. Daniel could imagine the cold calculation in Richard's mind. He must have waited until the house was quiet, the staff gone. He would have approached Maya and her puppies with a leash or some other pretense of care. Perhaps Maya had trusted him, trusted the brother of her beloved owner. Richard had taken them to the river, tying them to a rotting piece of driftwood. The chain Daniel found by the river confirmed it. Richard had intended for the current to carry them away, ensuring no trace of them could be found. If the plan had worked, Maya and her puppies would have been lost to the freezing waters, and no one would have questioned their disappearance. But he hadn't counted on Daniel. The thought made Daniel's stomach churn. He clenched his fists, the anger rising in him like a fire. He couldn't shake the image of Maya clinging to that driftwood, her desperate eyes locking onto his as she fought for her life and her puppies. He glanced at Maya now. She was calmer than before, her trust in him growing stronger every day. But the haunted look in her eyes hadn't completely faded. She had been through something no creature should endure. And for what? Greed. Pure, unrelenting greed. "This isn't over," Daniel muttered to himself. He knew he couldn't stop here. He had evidence, the chain, the will, and the testimonies of those who had seen Richard's behavior. But it wasn't enough to confront Richard outright. Daniel needed more, something concrete that would tie Richard directly to the crime, confronting the shadows. The next day, Daniel decided to return to the Bowen estate. He parked his truck a short distance from the property and approached on foot, careful to avoid drawing attention. The house loomed ahead, its once pristine exterior now seeming dark and foreboding. As he neared the gate, he noticed something that made his heart race. A black SUV parked in the driveway. Its windows were tinted and the engine was still warm, faint steam rising in the cold air. Daniel ducked behind a cluster of bushes and watched. The front door opened, and Richard stepped out, his face etched with frustration. He spoke into his phone, his voice sharp and angry, though the words were muffled by the distance. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't approach Richard directly, not without proof. Instead, he waited, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The weight of truth. As Richard drove away, Daniel stepped closer to the gate, his eyes scanning the property. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still hidden here, something that could expose the full extent of Richard's scheme. But he also knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who believed in Margaret's vision and who wouldn't stop until justice was served. Back in his truck, Daniel turned to Maya, her watchful eyes meeting his. "You're safe now," he said softly. "But we have to make sure he never does this to anyone else." The road ahead was uncertain, but Daniel's resolve had never been stronger. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also witnessed the unwavering determination of a mother fighting for her children, and he wasn't about to let that fight go to waste. The morning air was sharp and cold as Daniel pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Whitefall police station. In the passenger seat, Maya sat alert, her calm presence giving Daniel a sense of quiet determination. Today was the day they would confront the truth. Inside, Sheriff John Miller greeted him with a curt nod. The chain Daniel had found by the river was now stored securely as evidence, but Miller had dug deeper into the case since their last conversation. "I've got something," Miller said, leading Daniel into his office. He gestured to a monitor displaying grainy black-and-white footage. "This is from a traffic camera not far from the bridge on the night you found Maya and the puppies." Daniel leaned closer, his heart pounding. The footage showed a truck with a recognizable license plate pulling off the main road and heading toward the river. Miller paused the video, zooming in to reveal the driver. "It's Richard Bowen," Miller said grimly. "This places him at the scene." With the footage in hand, Miller and Daniel made their way to Margaret Bowen's estate. Richard was home, his black SUV parked in the driveway as it had been during Daniel's previous visit. Miller knocked firmly on the door, and after a few tense moments, Richard appeared. His face was lined with irritation, but that quickly shifted to unease as he saw the sheriff. "Sheriff Miller," Richard greeted, his tone forced. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," Miller said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about Margaret and her dogs." Richard hesitated, his eyes darting between Miller and Daniel. "I've already told you everything I know. I don't see how this concerns me." "It concerns you because we have evidence," Miller replied, holding up a still image from the footage. "This is you, near the bridge, on the night the dogs were abandoned." Richard's face paled. "That doesn't mean anything. I was just passing through—" "Cut the lies," Miller interrupted, his voice rising. "We know you abandoned Maya and her puppies. We have the chain from the river, the traffic camera footage, and witnesses who can attest to your behavior before Margaret's accident. It's over, Richard." Cornered, Richard's defenses crumbled. He sank into the nearest chair, his face a mix of anger and resignation. "Fine," he spat. "You want the truth? I left them there. I tied them to that damn log and sent them down the river. They were a nuisance, just like Margaret's ridiculous rescue fund." Daniel clenched his fists, his anger barely contained as Richard continued. "That dog and her puppies were the only thing standing in my way," Richard said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Margaret was always talking about her legacy, her animals. She didn't care about me. Even in her will, she left half her estate to those stupid dogs." "And Margaret's accident?" Miller pressed, his tone sharp. Richard hesitated, then sneered. "That was a stroke of luck. I didn't cause it, but I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. With her in a coma, I finally had control. All I needed to do was get rid of the dogs, and the rest would fall into place." Miller didn't waste another moment. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, securing them around Richard's wrists. "Richard Bowen, you're under arrest for animal cruelty, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to defraud your sister's estate. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard glared at Daniel as he was led to the police car, but Daniel didn't flinch. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief. The man who had caused so much pain was finally being held accountable. Back at the station, Miller filed the charges, while Daniel returned home with Maya and her puppies. The warmth of the house welcomed them, and for the first time, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. Maya curled up near the heater, her puppies snuggled close to her. As Daniel watched them, he couldn't help but think of Margaret, still in the hospital, unaware of everything that had happened. "We'll take care of them," Daniel said softly, as if speaking to Margaret herself, "and we'll make sure your legacy lives on." Justice had been served, but there was still work to do. Daniel knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could honor the love and dedication Margaret had poured into her animals. It was the least he could do for her, and for Maya and her family. The first rays of spring sunlight filtered through the hospital window, bathing the room in a soft glow. Margaret Bowen stirred, her eyes fluttering open for the first time in weeks. The sterile white walls around her felt foreign, but the familiar hum of machines reminded her of the accident. A nurse hurried into the room, her face lighting up with relief. "Welcome back, Miss Bowen," she said softly. "You've been through a lot." Margaret's voice was weak, but her first words were filled with urgency. "Maya, my dogs, are they okay?" The nurse hesitated, but before she could respond, the door opened and Daniel stepped in, holding a small box of flowers he had brought as a gesture of hope. Margaret looked at Daniel, confusion clouding her gaze. "Who are you?" Daniel introduced himself, his voice steady but warm. "My name's Daniel Harris. I'm the one who found Maya and her puppies." Margaret's eyes widened, tears forming as he recounted the story, finding Maya and the puppies in the freezing river, the chain, the driftwood, and the battle against the icy current. He explained how Maya's resilience and the puppies' survival had led him to uncover the truth about Richard's betrayal. When Daniel described how Richard had been arrested and the dogs brought to safety, Margaret wept silently. "I owe you more than words can say," Margaret said through her tears. "Maya, she's always been my strength, and now she's found someone like you to stand by her." Over the next few days, Margaret regained her strength, and Daniel visited often, bringing updates on Maya and her puppies. Margaret, ever the planner, began to speak of the future. "I want to make sure no animal is ever abandoned or hurt, the way Maya and her puppies were," Margaret told Daniel one afternoon. Her voice was stronger now, filled with resolve. "I've spent my life dreaming of creating a sanctuary, and now I want to make it a reality." Daniel nodded. "Your will and the fund, those were incredible ideas. But I think what happened with Maya could be the symbol of what you're building. People need to know her story, her strength and loyalty. It's what this rescue effort should stand for." Margaret smiled, her first true smile since waking. "Then that's what we'll do. Maya and her puppies will be the face of this sanctuary. Their story will remind people of the hope and love that animals bring into our lives, even in the darkest moments." As Margaret recovered, Daniel found himself returning to something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He formally adopted Maya and her puppies, who had become a constant source of joy and healing in his once empty home. Maya's trust in him grew with each passing day. She no longer carried the haunted look she had when he first pulled her from the river. Instead, her eyes now reflected gratitude and peace. Buddy, Daisy, and Max had grown stronger, their playful antics filling Daniel's days with laughter. The man who had once stood on the edge of despair now found himself looking forward to each new morning, not just for himself, but for the family he had unexpectedly gained. Months later, Margaret stood at the entrance of the newly established Sanctuary of Hope, her vision brought to life. The sprawling grounds included spaces for rescued animals to roam freely, a veterinary clinic for their care, and a community center for adoption events and education programs. At the heart of it all was a bronze statue of Maya and her puppies, symbolizing resilience, love, and second chances. Beside the statue was a plaque that read, "In honor of Maya, Buddy, Daisy, and Max, whose story reminds us that even in the darkest of times, love and hope can prevail." Daniel stood beside Margaret during the opening ceremony, Maya and the now fully grown puppies at his side. As the crowd gathered to celebrate the sanctuary's opening, Margaret turned to Daniel. "You saved them," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And in doing so, You saved me too. Daniel shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. I think we saved each other. As the sanctuary flourished, so did the lives of everyone it touched. Daniel continued to work with Margaret, dedicating his time to caring for the animals and sharing their stories. What had once been a life of emptiness for him had transformed into one filled with purpose and connection. And Maya? She remained the heart of it all, a living symbol of what could happen when compassion and determination triumphed over despair. For Daniel, Margaret, and the countless animals whose lives were yet to be saved, this was more than a new chapter. It was a new beginning. Daniel gazed at the radiant morning sky above the sanctuary of hope, the sunlight filtering through the trees like a quiet blessing. Beside him, Maya sat proudly, her golden fur glistening in the light, her eyes filled with a calm trust that mirrored his own sense of peace. He whispered softly, as though speaking to the heavens, "Thank you, Lord, for showing me that even in the darkest moments, there's still a path to redemption. Thank you for sending Maya and her little ones to remind me that love and hope can always find a way." Margaret stood nearby, watching the sanctuary thrive with visitors and animals. Together they marveled at how a story born from despair had transformed into a beacon of faith and compassion, inspiring countless others. The story of Daniel, Maya, and her puppies reminds us that hope can shine even in the bleakest times. But what about you? Have you experienced a moment where faith, love, or compassion changed your life? We want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below and inspire others with your journey. Whether it's a story of helping an animal, an act of kindness, or a moment of hope, your words could be the light someone needs today. Remember, with faith, no situation is hopeless, and your voice can help spread love and change the world.